just sort of related to what we've spoken about there, how can people become a morning person or learn to get up early more easily and more regularly?
Yeah. 3 days of pain, the rest is easy. So it takes about 3 days to shift the biological mechanisms to make you a morning person. Now, if you are a very strongly genetically determined night owl.
That's a thing?
That's a thing. So there are genetic mutations, they call them polymorphisms, that make some people night owls. They feel best psychologically and physically going to sleep at about 1, 2, or 3 a.m. and waking up somewhere around, 10, 11 a.m. or noon. Mm-hmm. That exists. Not just during development or teen years, but that exists, not just for social reasons. Other people are true morning people. They feel absolutely best going to sleep around 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. 10 p.m. would be late for them, and they feel great waking up at 4, 5, or 6 a.m. Okay. Most people feel best going to sleep somewhere between 10 and midnight and waking up somewhere between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. or so, maybe 5:30 to 8 a.m. Okay. So those are 3 bins of the night owl, the morning person, and then the more typical schedule, but it's heavily weighted toward that typical schedule if you look at the general population. So if somebody wants to get up earlier, you need to stack the 4 primary, what are called Zeitgebers or timekeepers. So named because some of the early chronobiologists that discovered this stuff and the underlying mechanisms were German, as it were. So the number one Zeitgeber, the number one way to shift your circadian clock, which is this cluster of neurons that sits a few centimeters above the roof of your mouth, is to view bright light at a time when you want to be awake, AKA the morning. Okay. So that's why I say get outside, look at the sun, toward the sun. Don't force yourself to stare at it. Don't damage your eyes. Blink as needed. No sunglasses. Eyeglasses, corrective lenses, and contacts are absolutely fine, even if they have UV protection. Okay. However, if you combine that with another Zeitgeber, the second most powerful Zeitgeber is exercise or movement. So if you do some jumping jacks, you skip some rope, or you even just take a walk while facing the sun, now you're starting to stack different Zeitgebers. And I'll explain the mechanisms in a moment. If you then also add caffeine, now this spits in the face a little bit of what I said a few minutes ago, but if you were to add caffeine, you can entrain, as it's called, the circadian clock to be alert at that time a bit more. And I'll be honest, if I'm going to exercise first thing in the morning, I need caffeine. I can't wait that 60 to 90 minutes. If I need to jump right into exercise, I find it's easiest for me to do 30 minutes after waking, 3 hours after waking, or 11 hours after waking. And a lot of people find that the same. But of course, exercise when you can, because it's that important. But if you want to, quote unquote, optimize your energy levels for exercise, typically people will notice that has to do with your temperature rhythm. Okay, so we've got sunlight, we've got exercise or movement of any kind. It could be jumping jacks, could be walking. You don't have to do a full workout. And then caffeine, and in some cases, food. I'm not big on eating first thing in the morning. I don't like to eat until 11 a.m. or noon. That's when my first meal arrives for me. Just naturally, that's when I get hungry. It's all caffeine and hydration prior to that. But if you were to eat something first thing in the morning, that's part of the way you entrain your circadian clock to wake up, to essentially wake you up earlier. And then the fourth one is a social rhythm. If you're interacting with other people, you're going to entrain your clock to that as well.
No way.
Yes. So there's a social component to it, circadian entrainment. Now, the pathways for these are from the eye, in the case of viewing light, to the circadian clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. In the case of caffeine, it's more general. In the case of exercise, there's literally a brainstem to circadian clock connection, a big superhighway of neuronal connections that then so-called entrains your circadian clock. Remember, your circadian clock generates an intrinsic 24-hour rhythm such that if we put you into constant dark or constant light, you would still sleep for a given bout and then be alert for a given bout with a little bit of a nap. It just is what we'd call free run. It would drift a little later each day. This is what happens when you go to Vegas. This is what happens when you're in an environment without a lot of cues about the day, the sunlight rising and setting cycle. Mm-hmm. Sunlight, exercise, caffeine and eating, and social interactions bring your circadian clock into alignment with all of those Zeitgebers. So when I said it takes 3 days, if tomorrow you want to start beginning the process of becoming an early riser, you'd set your alarm for 5 a.m. No matter what time you went to sleep the night before, you're going to get up and you're going to do the 4 things that I described. Maybe leave out food if you don't want to eat. Maybe leave out caffeine if you want to delay by 90 minutes. It's going to hurt. And then by the early afternoon, you'll be dragging a bit. And you just have to be careful to not overindulge in caffeine, which will then cause you to fall asleep later. Then you want to go to sleep at your now naturally slightly earlier sleep time. The next day, you'll notice it'll be a little bit easier to do the morning routine I just described. And by the third day, you ought to be waking up with or before the alarm by a few minutes or moments, because your circadian clock has phase shifted. Okay. It's phase advanced, as we say. Your circadian clock intrinsic to you generates a 24.2 or a 24.3 hour rhythm. It's not perfectly 24 hours. And that we believe, we don't know, but the just so story is that it's such that you're able to then shift that clock in one or the other direction. You can phase advance, so you wake up earlier and go to sleep earlier. You can phase delay. How do you phase delay? Well, you're probably doing this already. Everyone nowadays pretty much qualifies as a shift worker by the strict and not so strict criteria of shift work, which is, are you doing any kind of cognitive activity after 9 p.m.? Are you viewing any kind of bright lights after 9:30 p.m.? Most people would say yes. So the diabolical thing about the circadian timing system is that it requires a lot of bright light, ideally from sunlight, but a lot of bright light early in the day to make you a morning and daytime person. Mm-hmm. But it requires just a little bit of bright light, even from an artificial source, after the hours of about 9:30 p.m. till 4 a.m. to quash your melatonin and make it difficult to sleep, or if you sleep, to make that sleep not as effective. There's a simple remedy, however, which is, and this is a beautiful study published in Science Reports in 2022, if you view sunlight in the afternoon, even for 5 minutes or so, could be late afternoon, could be sunset, take off your sunglasses, look in the direction of the sun, so now looking west, you adjust the sensitivity of your retina, the neurons in the back of your eye, such that bright light later at night doesn't have quite as much effect to suppress melatonin. It reduces the melatonin suppressive effects by about 50% or offsets those. So I think of this afternoon viewing as, well, first of all, it's nice to look at a sunset. If you're indoors in an environment like this, even if there are bright lights on, get outside for a few minutes before the sun sets. This is especially important in winter. Even if you can't see the sun as an object, get some sunlight in your eyes, and that will at least partially offset the effects of bright light in your eyes at night, partially. And I refer to this more or less as your Netflix inoculation, so that night you can be on your phone or watching Netflix and it's not going to disrupt your sleep as much, but it will still disrupt your sleep somewhat. But let's, unless, like Rick Rubin's very diligent about wearing the red lens glasses. I've started doing that as well. But if you don't do that, well, I'm guessing he also sees the sunset in the evening. Mm-hmm. He's very attached, for good scientific reasons, to the sunlight thing. But these are little things that take just moments, right? They're essentially zero cost that can really improve your sleep. But that's how you become a morning person. If you want to become a night person, you do the opposite. You view bright light between the hours of 4 p.m. and 10 p.m. and then you will phase delay or phase shift in a delayed way your circadian clock, making you want to wake up later the next morning.
I wonder if dogs count as social interaction.
Absolutely. And they have all of the same mechanisms we just described.
So I just thinking, how can we stack that everything first thing in the morning walk?
Yeah.
If you're in a place that's not Iceland or somewhere that's super high north, dog, social interaction, moving around, and then caffeine if you do, or if you don't want it. But
if you have a dog that likes to run, you're even better off because it'll force you to run.
You're gonna have to chase after it.
If you have an English bulldog like I did, you'd be lucky if you get out of bed by 10.
A little bit, yeah. You're in.
Their eyes are droopy. They don't like to move. But it is the case that dogs will naturally orient toward the sun. And people always ask, do dogs have the same mechanisms? Absolutely. Intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, the one that project to the clock and carry all of this thing about circadian entrainment to sunlight, are present, as far as we know, in every extant mammalian species, every mammalian species that's alive today. This is a system that evolved from bacteria that's very similar to the opsins, the light-absorbing molecules that are in the insect eye. It's a very primordial system. It's organized very differently anatomically in the retina. And to me, it's actually one of the more beautiful systems in all of us. In fact, the one thing that no one can seem to defeat, you're never going to biohack away, is circadian biology. This 24-hour fluctuation in energy and focus. Some people require less sleep, but we're all more or less a slave to these mechanisms. And it's a good thing that we are, because it forces us to rest. Neuroplasticity occurs during sleep. It pushes down adenosine. It takes us through these natural ebbs and cycles of cognition. I'm obsessed by the idea that in sleep, the conscious mind obviously is not in control. The unconscious mind can geyser up thoughts. The brain is organizing things more in terms of symbols. Time and space are very organized very differently in dreams. And there's a lot of information to be gleaned from dreams. It's just that we don't yet understand what the symbols mean. The kind of classic Freudian Jungian interpretations are certainly not going to be complete, but I'm so grateful that we get this thing called sleep. And I think thanks to the great Matt Walker, we now understand that the whole thing about sleep when I'm dead is a really dumb mindset. And my team at the Huberman Lab podcast, we sometimes joke that we win by sleeping. When we're in the peak of things, we all encourage each other to get rest. Get rest. We really prioritize sleep. It's so essential.
What's happening from a neuroscience perspective as our friendships are getting weaker, even though our followerships and online friendships are getting bigger?
So at the neuroscience level, we have to remember that the brain circuitry, which of course is always linked to the body. We want to remember brain body are fortunately now understood to be interconnected. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that wasn't so much an accepted idea, but the nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, and all the connections to the body and back to the brain and spinal cord are bidirectional and highly interconnected. So when we say brain, I'm more or less using that as a proxy for whole nervous system, including body. The circuits that are responsible for feelings of social connectedness are deeply, deeply rooted in our need for safety. We could say this about any organism, but humans included need two things, I believe. We need the feeling of safety and acceptance. And so if we are to have a conversation about the kind of loftier words like peace, contentment, fulfillment, belonging. I think I borrowed that list, by the way, from the incredible Martha Beck. So it's not a coincidence that those rattled off my mind. But I feel like those four words are so critical to what we all want and what we all need at an aspirational level. We can't have a discussion about those without also, I believe, having a discussion about the fact that we have hardwired aspects of our nervous system, meaning genetic programs that are written into the script of all our genomes, regardless of color, regardless of background, that are just scripted into our genome that allow us to breathe without thinking about it, digest food without thinking about it, keep our heart rate going without thinking about it, elevated if it needs to be, slowed down if it needs to be, et cetera. And then hardwired circuitry that is there for bonding with our caretaker during early infancy and bonding with others of our species and evaluating whether there is safety and acceptance from the other members of our species. Now, these brain circuits have names, and we could get into that. They almost all have some connectedness to an area of the brain called the hypothalamus, which sits above the roof of your mouth, which has many, many dense collections of neurons we call nuclei, responsible for everything from temperature regulation to feeding to reproductive behavior, and on and on. All the basic kind of housekeeping things. But connected to those brain areas are brain areas that are associated with evaluating whether one is safe or not. So safety and acceptance, then we can break down in the following way if we look at it through this neuroscience lens. Safety is really about the ability to predict outcomes, okay? And the brain, after being responsible for all these housekeeping functions, heart rate, et cetera, is largely a predictive organ. It wants to understand what's going to happen next to the extent that it can then free up mental real estate, neural real estate to work on creative projects or to build things or to imagine things, right? There's no creativity, there's no building in the absence of safety. Then it just becomes survival. So the kind of older discussion, meaning in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, the discussion about the nervous system was we would hear about higher brain order functions and limbic functions, right? We would hear about kind of primitive lizard brain and more evolved brain. And all of that is frankly true. It remains true. And that language is perfectly fine. But I think if we are to think about safety and acceptance, we say, what is safety about? Safety is about being able to predict outcomes. When we are in the company of people, or we know we have people available to us, should we need something, food, Maybe we need a monetary loan. Maybe we need a word of encouragement. Maybe we need somebody to bounce ideas off of. Whatever it is that constitutes safety for us, it's highly subjective, highly individual. Well, then when those circuits can quiet down, it's as if, they can finally quiet down and say, we have enough safety so that then we can start to explore iterating what we have in terms of new jobs, new creative ideas, new art, take a walk with somebody you care about, right? Those are not the sorts of things you do when you feel that you are under siege, either real siege, physical siege, or emotional siege. Okay, then acceptance gets a little bit trickier to sort of pinpoint in the brain. Acceptance likely dovetails neurologically with these brain circuits for safety, because acceptance is really about, well, given the range of expressions that we have, our range of humor, our range of political beliefs, our range of behaviors, can I predict that these safety mechanisms will still be there? These people will still be there. These things will still be there. Will they turn on me? Will they honor me, right? Will they laugh with my jokes, or will they decide they don't want to talk to me anymore because of my jokes? These kinds of things. Now, what I'm trying to not do here, and at the same time do, is to put a neuroscience lens onto these two things of safety and acceptance. But if we were to just take a step back and say, what do we know to absolutely be true? Well, safety and acceptance, belonging, peace, contentment, etc., come from a variety of sources. Certainly, in our early relationship with our caretakers, these circuits form that are basically all about resonance with the caretaker. Alan Shore here at UCLA has done beautiful work on this. I think the book's title is called Right Brain Psychotherapy. And it's really about how the bonding of infant and typically mother, but or caretaker, the bonding of infant, and I'll just say mother since that's the more typical scenario, there's actually a lot of synchronization of brain networks early on, such that one's physical and mental state reflects the other, and so on. And so from the very earliest stages that we come into the world, we are resonating with other people. Call it energy if you want, call it emotions, it's neurochemical. Yes, it involves oxytocin, but a whole lot else. In other words, we leave infancy and childhood and adolescence, if we have a healthy upbringing, with a sense of predictability. Someone can be there and then not be there. They're accessible if we need them, et cetera. Now, that sort of relationship, that connectivity between humans and safety and acceptance in those relationships has been explored extensively. I think we've all seen the image of the mother and child and the brain imaging and seeing some sort of collaborative activation of their brain networks. That's been explored extensively, and it's beautiful work, and we could always use more of that sort of work. What's been explored far less is the safety and acceptance that occurs between romantic pairs, although there are laboratories starting to do that, having people, for instance, look at the face of their significant other, angry, sad, et cetera, while in brain scanners, even scanning of two individuals separately at the same time, those sorts of things. Far less has been done on this notion of friendship. But I think in this day and age when it seems like everything is more complicated, but I'm sure they've been saying that for decades, if not hundreds of thousands of years. What do we know about friendship? Friendship is one of the most reliable sources of predictability that exists within human interactions. Why? Because you can have many, many friends, and you don't have to break up with one friend to have another friend. When we're little, they say, who's your best friend? And maybe then you could only have one. But pretty soon we realize that we can have many great friends, many best friends. And I consider you one of those. Like, we're growing our friendship, but there's no sense of trade-off, even though, of course, time is always a trade-off. In fact, you were at a gathering at my home with many other friends, right? These things can be collaborative. Typically in romantic relationships, while there are exceptions to this, is typically a pairing, right? So there are clearly brain networks that are overlapping with the brain networks associated with parent-child or child-caretaker relationships and romantic relationships that involve the generation of safety and acceptance among friends. The major difference, however, is that friends throughout history, even when people lived in small villages, tended to be dispersed by greater distances. And so when we hear about the loneliness crisis, are we hearing about a crisis of lack of connectivity with our parents? Maybe. With our siblings? Possible. With romantic others? That's a whole domain into itself. You cover a lot of that and the challenges associated with finding and building healthy romantic relationship. But what we know for sure, based on extensive research now, is that there's a real dearth of close friendships for many, many people, not just in the US, but abroad as well. Now, we could make an argument that it's by virtue of smartphones, but I don't think we want to go there just yet. I think Jonathan Haidt's doing a beautiful job exploring those ideas, and he's far better equipped to kind of pinpoint the relationships, causal or otherwise, than I am. But here's what we know for sure. With friends, we can both hope for and expect safety and acceptance by virtue of having lots of different kinds of friends. Friends with whom we play sport, friends with whom we just hang out, friends with whom we don't really talk too much at all, and friends with whom we drop into deep conversation with. So one of the things that I personally have found to be immensely beneficial in my own life, and for which it's clearly had an outsized positive effect relative to the time required, is a simple good morning text that comes on a reliable schedule, meaning every single morning. Now, this might sound almost trivial, but when I wake up in the morning, I either receive or send a good morning text to, right now, there are about 3 people in that kind of collection. They're not talking to each other. But if I don't receive that text by noon, it activates something in me. It's not a ton of anxiety, but it activates something. Are they okay? What's going on with them? It isn't, why aren't they checking up on me? I assume something's come up. But the simple receival of a text from somebody saying good morning, I think has both ancient and modern significance. Ancient in the sense that one of the first things that everyone experienced when we lived in small villages, because that's essentially how we evolved, was to see faces of other, what biologists call conspecifics, and other same non-conspecific people, like people that could be romantic partners or family members or people we were going to work with. We saw faces first thing in the morning. And we know with certainty, because there's a ton of beautiful work, mainly from Nancy Kanwisher's laboratory at MIT, a brilliant researcher, as well as a woman named Doris Sau, who now is at Berkeley, was at Caltech, that there's an immense amount of neural real estate devoted to the processing of faces, not just facial expressions, but human faces in particular. Now, monkeys have the same brain area for monkey faces. So this is not an area that's just designed to see eyes, nose, and mouth. It's a brain area that has neural real estate that responds specifically to the faces of other humans in humans. And there's a whole lot to talk about how it's connected with areas of the brain involved in emotion and emotion regulation, et cetera. But the simple act of sending a good morning text to one person and receiving that back, perhaps exchanging a note or two about what's your plan for the day, doesn't have to be an extensive back and forth, but the same person or persons consistently, I've experienced in my own life in times both good and bad and kind of neutral, that it has this outsized positive effect. And I don't think that's because I was lacking social interaction. My life is very full. I have a very busy business life. I can go online and see faces. But when we go online and see a familiar influencer or a familiar political figure or a familiar even family member, yes, they're there. And I think there's great power to that. But they aren't there specifically to see us. Although as creators, we know that we are there to see our audience and for them to see us. That's a real thing. But it's quite different to have this exchange, this reciprocity. And I really believe that if there was one thing that we could each and all do to better our lives, no matter how busy our social schedule or our at-home environments, is to have at least one, but probably 1 to 3, depending on your bandwidth, 1 to 3 friends that every single morning when you wake up, you text them and they text you back. Just a simple good morning. Why? Because it's the reliability. It's this notion of expectation being fulfilled. It's not a huge expectation. And this brings us back to safety and acceptance, right? No one's going to text us good morning if they don't accept us, if they dismiss us. And the safety is in the predictability of the interaction. Now, for people that walk to the corner and they see the barista and they get their coffee or they see their neighbor, et cetera, the importance of saying hello to people on the street, this is something that's really fallen away these days. Depends on where you live, but people are very much in their phones. People are very much afraid, frankly, of how they will be reacted to if they were to reach out to somebody that they don't know. These basic human interactions take us back hundreds, if not thousands, maybe even tens or hundreds of thousands of years. And if I were to put my money on any experiment, it would be that there is dedicated neural machinery for these sorts of practices. And while social media has wonderful contributions and significance to make in the well-being of our lives, I truly believe that, I am absolutely certain that these simple practices, just as morning sunlight can profoundly affect our daytime mood, focus, and alertness and nighttime sleep, I think these simple practices of saying good morning by text each morning to the same person or people and receiving a text back sets something on the shelf like, okay, we're good to move forward through the day.